we are, Chapter 9, the Pact. The newspaper articles were working. The polls were showing that most Americans favored the pipeline. Everything was looking good until one day. They were all sitting around the office talking about nothing important when Ben suddenly came charging into the room. Have you seen this? This is bad, very bad, Ben explained, moving quickly into the room towards the computer. He opened up the screen and pulled up a website. It's a website promoting a petition against the pipeline. The site was an anti-government conspiracy site claiming that the pipeline was a front for all types of communist actions against American people. To force people into labor camps isn't even for water, but for oil and natural gas. That the pipeline isn't for water, but for oil and natural gas. So people don't know what the government is up to. It states that Amy, Jim, Ben, and Bob are not advocates for a better future, but government employees. There is personal information about where they went to school, what classes they took, all to help back up the claims to support their smear campaign. There was even a picture of Amy walking into the Capitol building in Washington to support the claim that she worked there. It showed Jim once worked for Global Water Corp to support the question, why would he be working against them now? They had copies of his record showing that he was in good standing when he worked there and that his leaving was beneficial to both parties. Jim looked at the group and replied, most of the students at the university worked at Global at some time. They had a plant right in Boston. They wrote that Bob usually wrote pro-government articles, proving that he supported the government and not the people. But the real kicker, and shock to everyone but Ben, was that Mara's father was the CFO of Global Water Corp, and that Ben was working directly for him. If he were to marry Mara, he would gain a lot from the success of GWC. The group was shocked. I don't work for Global, Ben replied defensively. They all sat quietly for a moment. They just looked at the screen. The election is only 2 months away. We don't need this happening right now, Amy said gravely. Ben, why didn't you tell us that your girlfriend's father runs Global? Jim said, not trying to hide his accusing tone. Let me rephrase that. Hey, Ben, why didn't you tell us that your girlfriend's father runs Global? That's better. Jim said, not trying to hide his accusing tone. Because I didn't think it was important, Ben replied innocently. The whole group suddenly erupted. There was yelling, accusing, and questioning. And it went on for a while until Ben finally stormed out. The last thing he said before he walked out was, I didn't have to come here, Amy, and I came here to help you. I did it because you're my friend. After Ben left, Jim and Amy turned the conversation towards how somebody who knew them would have had to have helped create the website because of the type of information they had. They didn't say it directly, but Amy could tell that Jim and Bob thought Ben had betrayed them. She even had to admit that part of her wondered if it could be true. The next day, upon arriving at the office, the group was met by reporters who wanted to comment on the new development. Bob suggested that Amy and Jim walk by quietly and not say anything. He would handle the press since he had experience with them anyway. When he reached the top of the stairs, he turned around to face the mob of cameras and microphones. They were doing their best, pushing and shoving and shouting out questions erratically. He stood there quiet for a few moments until the crowd realized that he would not speak until they stopped. Once they stopped pushing and shoving and shouting, Ben began to speak. Here's a quote that I'm quite fond of and remind myself of often because I'm a journalist. They started again and he stopped talking. They remembered the rule, shut up or he won't talk, and settled down again. He didn't blame them, it was just their way. He cleared his throat and began. I'm a journalist. It is very easy to mistake the fine line between reporting facts and spreading lies. Dare I say, gossip. I leave you with this today. Do what you want with it. Sophistry is only fit to make men more conceit in their ignorance. Remember that. John Locke said that, he said smugly. With that, he turned around and walked into the building. He felt very pleased with himself until he got into the office. Jim and Amy looked like they had been through the ringer already. What? He said. There are about 20 messages on the phone from reporters, newspapers, everybody, Jim said frustratingly. He stood behind Amy, who was slumped over her chair. We wrote all of them down in case you thought there were any that we should respond to. And Ben, Amy said, sounding a bit annoyed. Ben called too. He went back to New York last night. He sounded really pissed. He doesn't want anything to do with the project anymore. He's through with it. You could hear the sadness in her voice. She was disappointed. She wasn't sure if she was disappointed in Ben or herself. She was still not convinced that Ben had anything to do with it, but she couldn't believe he would do something like that. Might I make a suggestion? Bob said somewhat timidly. Amy and Jim just looked at him. A pact. I'll draw it up. I suggest we make a pact, sort of a guideline to follow, and we all agree on it. Just for the time being, we need to protect ourselves. What do you think? Jim and Amy looked at each other and shrugged. Might not be a bad idea. Can you write something up and we'll review it? Amy asked. She had to admit that she wasn't sure what was safe to say and to whom anymore. Bob had experienced this in his field, so it might be a good idea. Feeling the tension in the room, Bob excused himself to go work on the pact. He suggested the two stay there for a while to avoid the mess outside, although most of the mob dispersed. After Ben's statement. After Bob left the room, Amy and Jim sat silently. Nobody said this was going to be easy, Amy said in a diplomatic tone. I know you don't think Ben had anything to do with it, had anything to do with the website, Jim said in his usual direct manner. I don't know, baby. I've known Ben for a really long time. It's not like him. What about Bob? Amy asked decisively. It could have been him. He could have a lot of access to all sorts of information. He wants to be a famous writer. He wants a Pulitzer. Who knows how far he'll go to get it? Again, knowing that Jim's argument was better than hers, Ben had a lot more to gain, hands down. Bob has been my friend since we were children, he shouted back at her. Just admit it. Your friend betrayed us. He was trying to sabotage us right from the beginning. You don't want to admit it because you brought him here. Amy had never seen him act like this before. He was really angry. She was taken off guard. I don't want to do this anymore, she said, sitting at her desk and laying her head down. Fine, Jim said. Let's just wait and see what Bob comes up with. Once again, they sat and didn't talk for the next hour and a half until Bob returned. The pact was a list of rules, who they could talk to, what they could say. It also said that until the polls in November, they couldn't talk about the project with anybody, not even friends or family, if they were alone. Any interviews or conversations had to be approved by the whole group, and at least one other group member had to be present at the time. They had 2 months. They could do this. They all signed. In the days and weeks that followed, the tension from conspiracy websites faded a bit, but there was very little talk about it or Ben. Still, it was undisputed that their approval ratings for the project dropped. Hopefully not enough to hurt them, but they definitely dropped. The pact gave them some peace of mind. But it was still in the back of their heads that somebody, most likely Ben, betrayed them. If he had done it once, when he was a part of the team, what would stop him from doing more harm now that he isn't a part of the team? Keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer, Amy often thought about that saying. She still didn't believe that Ben conspired against them. But even if he did, It was a colossal mistake chasing him off the way they did. She wouldn't have handled it like that. It didn't matter. Anyway, it was done. Although it provided them with some peace of mind, the Pact wasn't used much in the following months. The news stations and media picked up where they wanted to. Some approached it as if it were actually a group of young activists trying to change the world. Others picked up the conspiracy theory that they were a part of a ruse and working for the government, trying to trick the public into giving them the support that they needed to create work camps and prison camps. All potential interviews only wanted to talk about the conspiracy theories and its connections. Bob handled the PR. Once he told them that they would only do interviews as a group and only talk about the pipeline, the interviews were called off. Bob continued to write the common sense solution. Some of the papers stopped publishing it, but most didn't. Either way, it was online and anyone could read it if they wanted to. But no matter how you cut it, they weren't given any opportunity to defend themselves. As time passed, the election grew closer. They waited for the article to be canceled entirely. Where was the hammer? Why didn't it drop? They didn't care. They were just happy it wasn't worse. Next chapter is the lieutenant. That's Amy's dad.